Okay, I'm starting the webinar.
Very good morning. Shall I proceed, Frankie?
Yes, VP, you can proceed.
Thank you very much. What a beautiful morning it is. I don't know if spring has already started before time, but we are really grateful for the good weather, at least in Gauteng, which is a province in South Africa. And we hope that everybody else at other areas of our continent and the globe are also enjoying a beautiful weather and beautiful atmosphere. Allow me to acknowledge all ombudsmen present, our phenomenal panelists, Honorable Veronica McQuell, Ms. Samgelisiwe Jali, Dr. Janine Hicks, our facilitator, Ms. Yolisa Makasi. I'll get an opportunity to introduce them properly to all of us later on, but it is really with a great pleasure that I greet them this morning. And to all our participants from across the globe, a very good morning and welcome to this significant webinar organized by the African Ombudsman Research Center, commonly known as AORC, in collaboration with the African Ombudsman and Mediators Association, the International Ombudsman Institute, and the University of KwaZulu-Natal, who is our partner throughout in the AORC project. I wish to express my sincere gratitude to the organizing team and our partners in this discussion. As we gather today to celebrate South African Women's Month, we are reminded of the profound words of the United Nations Office of the Special Advisor on Gender Issues. I quote, "Gender equality refers to that stage of human social development at which the rights, responsibilities, and opportunities of individuals will not be determined by the fact of being born male or female," I unquote. Ombudsman institutions stand as pillars of accountability, tasked with strengthening constitutional democracy by investigating improper conduct, reporting on systemic issues, and making recommendations or remedial actions in cases of public protectors, such as that of the South African study. Yet our influence extends far beyond addressing individual complaints. We are uniquely positioned to champion gender equity, both within our own institutions and in the communities which we serve. The Public Protector South Africa has witnessed firsthand how gender inequality manifests in our society. Our data reveals critical patterns while we receive thousands of complaints annually. Men significantly outnumber women in approaching our office directly. This disparity reflects deeper structural barriers that prevent women from accessing justice mechanisms. No country has yet eliminated the gender gap entirely. Women still constitute 2/3 of the world's illiterate population, earn on average 78% of men's wages for the same work, and remain underrepresented in decision structures. Actually, probably saying the same work is underestimating, because other than a day-to-day job, women still have a job to do at home. In South Africa, despite constitutional guarantees of equality, women continue to face systemic discrimination in accessing state services, from housing allocations to maintenance enforcement. This webinar goes beyond abstract discussion. It's a clarion call. We're here to explore how ombudsman and public protector officers can lead by developing internal policies that ensure equitable workplaces and strengthen our capacity to tackle gender-based discrimination in the public sector. But also, how do we use our powers to ensure developmental policies for our respective countries? From the public protector, we actually concluded the systemic investigation that looked into the justice system in our country and its capabilities and abilities to enforce women's rights. We found a number of gaps, which we've made remedial actions to government. Currently, we are busy with the systemic investigation into maintenance, because that too is gender-based violence and affects women at large. The three focus areas of today's discussion: internal gender inclusive policies, investigating gender-based discrimination, and advocacy for systemic change, represent the comprehensive approach required to achieve meaningful transformation. These pillars are interconnected and mutually reinforcing, forming the foundation upon which effective gender-responsive ombudsman or public protector institutions can be built. Firstly, developing and implementing internal gender-inclusive human resources and institutional policies serves as the cornerstone of transformation. As ombudsman institutions, we cannot credibly advocate for gender equality in the public sector while our own houses are not in order. Internal policies that promote gender-inclusive recruitment, equal pay, flexible working arrangements, and protection against sexual harassment create the enabling environment necessary for our staff to deliver effective services. When we establish family-friendly policies, mentorship programs for women, and clear pathways for career advancement, regardless of gender, we not only enhance our institutional capacity, but also model the very standards we expect from other public institutions. Our experience at the Public Protector's Office in South Africa demonstrates that when internal policies are genuinely inclusive, they unlock the full potential of our workforce. Women bring unique perspectives to investigations, particularly in cases involving gender-based violence, discrimination in social services, and violations of reproductive rights. A gender-balanced and empowered workforce enhances our ability to understand and respond to the diverse needs of all citizens. Secondly, investigating and addressing gender-based discrimination while improving women's access to justice represents the operational heart of our mandate. This requires developing specialized investigative protocols that are sensitive to the unique challenges women face when accessing public services. From our data, we know that women's complaints often relate to fundamental life issues: fraudulent annulment of marriages, delays in birth certificate registration for their children, failure to enforce maintenance orders, and inadequate responses to sexual harassment, particularly within state departments. Gender-sensitive investigation protocols must account for the fact that women may face additional barriers in reporting violations, including fear of retribution, cultural constraints, and economic dependence. Our investigators must be trained to recognize the intersectoral nature of discrimination, how gender intersects with race, class, disability, and other identities to create compounded disadvantages. When we investigate a complaint about irregular housing allocations, for instance, we must examine whether gender-based discrimination played a role in the decision-making. Moreover, improving women's access to justice means ensuring that our complaint mechanisms are accessible, that our communication is clear, and culturally appropriate, and that our remedial actions address both immediate harms and underlying systemic issues. It means recognizing that for many women, approaching the public protector or the ombudsman represents a last resort after other institutions have failed them. Thirdly, forming partnerships and engaging in advocacy to advance systemic gender equity and inclusive governance acknowledgements that sustainable change requires collective action beyond our individual institutional boundaries. No single ombudsman office, however well-intentioned, can dismantle centuries of patriarchal structures alone. Strategic partnerships amplify our impact and create networks of accountability that extend across government spheres, but across borders. Effective advocacy for systemic change requires us to move beyond individual case resolution to identify patterns of discrimination and recommend policy reforms. When we observe recurring complaints about the non-enforcement of maintenance orders, we must advocate for legislative and procedural changes in the Department of Justice, for instance. When we see patterns of sexual harassment within state departments or institutions, we must work with those institutions, and particularly the departments that deals with public service and administration, to strengthen prevention and response mechanisms. International collaborations such as today's webinar, featuring expertise from Argentina, demonstrates how we can learn from global best practices while adapting solutions to our local context. The sharing of investigation methodologies, policy frameworks, and advocacy strategies strengthens the entire ombudsman community's capacity to advance gender equality. These three focus areas are not separate silos, but interconnected elements of a holistic transformation strategy. Internal gender-inclusive policies create the foundation for credible internal advocacy. Effective investigation of gender-based discrimination informs our understanding of systemic issues that require policy reform. Strategic partnerships enhance our capacity to implement both internal changes and external advocacy and efficiency. As accountability institutions, we have both the mandate and the moral obligation to ensure that our work reflects the needs and experiences of all citizens, particularly those who have been historically marginalized. Our constitutions, as they envisage a society based on democratic values, social justice, and fundamental human rights, must be enforced. And we have to ensure, as accountability in oversight institutions, that there are streamlined implementation mechanisms. Today's discussion will equip us with practical tools and strategies to advance this transformation agenda. We will learn from each other's experiences, challenges, and innovations. Most importantly, we will commit to create actions that will make our institutions more effective champions of gender equality. Allow me at this moment to take up the privilege to introduce our distinguished facilitator, who will guide us through today's important discussion. Ms. Yolisa Makhasi brings to this webinar an extraordinary depth of experience in public service transformation and gender empowerment. Her distinguished career in the public sector spans nearly 3 decades, culminating in her appointment as Director General of the Department of Public Service and Administration from 2020 to February 2025. Ms. Makhasi began her role as the head of public service reforms at the New South Institute, NSI, in March 2025, with the New South Institute officially announcing her appointment on the 3rd of March 2025. She leads the Institute's initiatives focused on public service reform and the professionalization of civil service, bringing extensive experience from her previous role. Her academic credentials are equally impressive, holding a Master of Philosophy in Coaching Management from Stellenbosch University, a Master's in Public Policy and Management from the University of Manchester, and currently pursuing a doctorate in administration from the University at the University of KwaZulu-Natal. As a qualified executive coach, Ms. Makhasi is passionate about leadership development and women's empowerment, particularly in nurturing the next generation of young women leaders. Her extensive leadership experience, combined with her commitment to fostering presence, self-awareness, growth, and resilience, makes her the ideal person to facilitate today's crucial conversation. Ms. Makhasi's expertise in the public service transformation and our understanding of the systemic challenges facing women in governance structures align perfectly with today's webinar objectives. Her leadership in driving policy reforms and her commitment to inclusive governance will undoubtedly enrich our discussions. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me to welcome a phenomenal woman, Ms. Yoliswa Makhasi, as our facilitator for today's webinar on gender inclusive policy, a guide for ombudsman officers. Thank you very much.
Wow, thank you so much, Advocate Gcaleka, our public protector in South Africa. And I think it's good morning from my time in South Africa, and I'd just like to say good morning to everybody who is connected in this webinar today. It is indeed my pleasure to really be part of the proceedings that are taking place today. I do want to extend my sincerest and warm greetings to the esteemed guests who are gracing this occasion today, Your Excellencies, Honorable Ombudsman. It is my pleasure to be a program director today. Allow me to acknowledge the host, Advocate Gcaleka, who is a chair of the African Ombudsman Research Center. She is also an executive member of the African Ombudsman and Mediators Association. She is the president of International Ombudsman Institute in the African region and public protector of South Africa. I don't know how you do all these roles, Ms. Public Protector. I know you have a very busy schedule just as a public protector in South Africa. We are keeping you very busy with all our problems and investigations that we have to do in South Africa. I would also like to acknowledge the panel members. I believe that information has been sent in relation to the panelists, but I will just acknowledge the panel members briefly at this stage, all of them. And I do want to, just coming to the webinar, the theme of this webinar, I think the public protector has said enough about the webinar itself and its objectives, but I do want just to say that it's the theme is focusing on celebrating South African Women's Month and gender inclusive policies, a guide for ombudsman offices. This takes place during the Women's Month in South Africa, so it's quite appropriate that you are celebrating South African Women's Month. And Women's Month in South Africa briefly is about commemoration of historic resistance and ongoing transformation of South African society from an apartheid era to the democratic system that that was ushered in 1994 in South Africa. The Women's Month is commemorated annually because we honor more than 20,000 women who marched to union buildings on 9th August 1956. They were protesting against the Unjust Pass Laws and Urban Areas Act, which limited their movements, firstly as Black people in South Africa, but also as women. So this year marks the 69th anniversary of Women's Month, of the women marching to Union Building, and 30th anniversary of South Africa's official National Women's Day, which has been extended to Women's Month. So PP has spoken about the objectives of the webinar and the information has been shared. So I will not want to extend more, to give more information around that, but I do want to call upon our first speaker, Ms. Samkelisiwe Jali, who is an attorney of the High Court, who who is a lecturer at the School of Law, University of KwaZulu-Natal in South Africa. And the topic she will be dealing with is developing and implementing gender-inclusive HR and institutional policies. I must say that the public protector has highlighted that I work as a head for public sector reform at the New South Institute, an institute that is affiliated with GIBS, Gordon's Business Institute, which is a member, I think, a part of the bigger University of Pretoria in South Africa. It's so I look forward to this topic and the other topics that are going to be presented, because I do think I'm going to learn a lot of things as well as part of the work we do on gender inclusivity in relation to reforms, public sector reforms. How do we ensure that there is a gender inclusivity in the reforms agenda in reforming the public sector in South Africa and hopefully in Africa at large? So over to you, Ms. Samukeli Siwejali. I was informed that each panelist has 10 to 15 minutes, and I was informed that you are going to be going to court immediately after this, and therefore I will have to give you your 3 to 5 minutes to just reflect on some of the questions that were sent earlier after you make your presentation. Over to you, Samukeli Siwe. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Makasi. I'd first like to greet the organizers of this very necessary webinar, the distinguished guests, and lastly, but not least, our attendees. Admittedly, when I first listened to our esteemed facilitator, Ms. Makasi, introducing me, I thought to myself, no, sister, what I actually am is a very tired working mother, which then led me to my next thought, which is, why have I agreed to this? Which is why, possibly, as I've already said, this is a very necessary webinar, more so because it lends to a particular thought that I have been stewing a lot on lately. I was listening to the short clip of this talk show to which Tamara, from Tia and Tamara, as one of its castmates, and she was telling the other woman on her panel that she had noticed that of late, her young daughter was gravitating a lot towards her father. And obviously, this is a byproduct of spending more time with him than her. It was her departing a remark, however, that really caught my attention. She said that she hopes one day she'll be able to explain to her daughter why she worked so hard. And this explanation was that it was because she really loved her. It was in that very public moment of vulnerability that I understood her completely. I too am like her. I have a young daughter who lately I haven't been spending as much time with her as I'd like to. And like Tamara, I do all of what I do because I love her. I work hard because I want her to see that birthing her was no mistake to me. Every provision brought in by the sweat of my brow and carried in by my weary mind and tired feet is out of love. Hence today with this topic, I come in a little bit heavy. I've been asked to speak on developing and implementing internal gender inclusive HR and institutional policies. And on this end, I have prepared a short talk about what is not only relatable to myself, but what I believe may be relatable to most logged in today. I will center my discussion on the not so recent scaling judgment on parental leave that was delivered on the 25th of October 2023 by the Honorable Deputy Judge President of Gauteng High Court Division, Roland Sutherland. I'd like to take you on this journey. Maybe you and your partner are a working couple. You're planning your lives, you both have high-powered careers, and you decide to get married. You have a baby, you think you'll share your parental responsibilities equally, but one has 10 days leave and the other has 4 months. She makes the sacrifice, and in that time, he's working like crazy. He gets promoted and she starts taking on less strenuous work because the responsibility of their child falls on her. He's promoted whilst her career remains stagnant. Or you're more like Mr. Van Wyk, a salaried employee whose wife has her own business. Both parties wish that Mrs. van Wyk would return to trade as soon as possible, as her business might fail if she is not active. In turn, Mr. van Wyk would be the primary caregiver during the early infancy of their child, and obviously no question of maternity leave arose for Mrs. van Wyk. Mr. van Wyk, however, was ineligible for more than 10 days paternity leave. What he did, though, was to take extended leave, partly unpaid, from his employer by means of an ad hoc arrangement. He was not entitled to any UIF payout. Both illustrations, as argued by the applicants, triggers a violation of Section 9 of our Constitution. The value of these examples is to illustrate that their family models were simply not catered for by the Basic Conditions of Employment Act. No sound reason existed for it to not do so. Indeed, the Van Wyk family dynamic is wholly consistent with the norms that the Constitution exalts. Today, I will unpack this judgment with you under the following subheadings. What are the current changes pending remedial legislation? What are the best interests of the child? What of the business objectives? And what are the international standards? This application, ladies and gentlemen, was about the allegations of unconstitutionality of sections 25, 25 capital A, 25 capital B, and 25 capital C in the Basic Conditions of Employment Act 75 of 1997, which deal with maternity and parental leave. The Basic Conditions of Employment Act is one of a suite of statutes that regulate employment and labor relations. Section 9 of our Constitution speaks of the right to equality, and Section 10 of the Constitution on the right to dignity, which of course pervades every aspect of life. The controversy was whether these particular provisions in the Basic Conditions of Employment Act were unconstitutional because they unfairly discriminated against persons in violation of Sections 9 or 10 of our Constitution. Here we had three sets of applicants. The first and second applicant were Werner and Ita van Wyk, a married couple and parents of a child. The second applicant was Sonke Gender Justice, whose role is public advocacy in support of gender equality. The third applicant was the Commission for Gender Equality, a Chapter 9 institution. I will return to the work of these institutions briefly in my closing. The sole respondent was the Minister of Labour, who is the custodian of the Basic Conditions of Employment Act. In addition, there were 6 entities who joined as amicus curiae, and 4 of them, the Centre for Human Rights of the University of Pretoria, Solidarity Centre South Africa, International Lawyers Assisting Workers Network, and the Labor Research Service advanced a common argument in support of the applicant's criticism of the Basic Conditions of Employment Act. A 5th amicus was the National Employers Association of South Africa, who makes common cause with the Minister of Labour in opposing the criticism of the Basic Conditions of Employment Act. The 6th amicus did not participate in the hearing. Most of us here know that there are different categories of leave, namely your annual, your sick, your family responsibility, etc. Of note here is the category of leave that relates to the relationship of employees as parents to their children. This guaranteed period of leave does not compel an employer to pay an employee. Section 25, 25A, capital A that is, 25 capital B, 25 capital C, and 26 regulate the granting of such leave. The most recent amendments in terms of sections 25 capital A to 25 capital C were introduced by Act 3 of 2018 and came into effect on January the 1st, 2020. The cited provisions of the Basic Conditions of Employment Act differentiate between 3 categories of a child: a child born of a mother, a child born by surrogacy, and an adopted child. A mother's circumstances are dealt with in sections 25 and 26. Section 25 goes on to provide for a total of 4 consecutive maternity leave for a birth mother, of which 1 may be taken prior to the date of birth. And in terms of the previous position, section 25 capital A1 and 25 capital A2, capital A 2 subsection A, a father is entitled, or rather was entitled, to 10 days leave as from the date of birth of the child. The guaranteed leave in section 25 capital A and 25 capital B and 25 capital C, which was compulsory for an employer to grant, as alluded to before, does not require the employer to pay any remuneration. The effect of the BCEA was that the employee has taken time off and has job security to return back to work. In all 3 categories, the employer on this type of leave may claim a financial benefit from the Unemployment Insurance Fund in such sums as determined by the Minister of Labour. Colleagues, it's plain to see that there was a differentiation between the mothers and fathers, between a birth mother and or other mothers or parents. The claims made and the relief which was sought by the applicants in simple terms can be described as such. Sections 25(1) is unconstitutional because no valid grounds exist to distinguish one parent employee from another. Thus, both parents should be entitled to parental leave in equal measure, and the failure to provide so is unfair discrimination and violates the dignity of all parents. The differentiation in the duration of prescribed leave available to each of the 3 classes of parents, a birth mother and father, adoptive parents, and parents parents of a child born through surrogacy, constitutes unfair discrimination and violates the dignity of all parents. It was contended that all categories should enjoy an equal duration of leave. Furthermore, that the notion that the prescribed leave is available to adoptive parents only in respect of a child of less than 2 years of age was challenged as irrational and unfair discrimination. The minister argued that the present suite of benefits in the Basic Conditions of Employment Act compares favorably with other states' benefits, more especially if appropriate jurisdictions are chosen to compare. That the choice being directed by having regard to countries which have socio-economic profiles similar to that of South Africa. Resistance by the minister to the challenges to the Basic Conditions of Employment Act were based on the proposition that what is in the statute does not violate any constitutional guarantees. This was, in a limited sense, technically true, because the true location of the criticism is what is not in the Basic Conditions of Employment Act. Furthermore, the minister contended that the controversy put before the court was not suitable for judicial adjudication because it is intrinsically a matter of social policy involving resource allocation, which is a subject matter better left to Parliament to evaluate and make choices. NIESA also opposed the relief sought as supposedly bad for business and shared the minister's views that the controversy should best be left to Parliament to address. Ladies and gentlemen, the crux of the case was about unequal treatment of persons. The approach to the resolution of such a controversy about inequality is set out in the case of Hodgson versus Lane. Let's deal with the first question that this case presents. Is there discrimination in the provisions? That there is differentiation on the grounds of gender requires no further explication. There is also a differentiation between the categories of parenthood. The controversy is therefore engaged at the second stage of the Hodgson versus Lane inquiry, which is there discrimination per se? And if so, is it unfair? The court held that distinguishing fathers and mothers in relation to child nurture was unfair discrimination as regards to duration of leave entitlements. The practical question is about an opportunity for a father to participate in the child nurture at a very critical early stage of childhood. The delinquent father problem was not a relevant factor in deciding this question. The opportunity premise requires, therefore, a further explication. To accord a paltry 10 days leave to a father speaks to a mind that regards the father's involvement in early parenting as marginal. This, the court held, was offensive to the norms of our Constitution in that it impairs the dignity in that it impairs the father's dignity. A major argument advanced to criticize this provision was that it is unfair on the mother to be deemed and doomed to be the principal caregiver, and the burden of the child should be shared equally with their father. Anyone who's a parent now knows how onerous parenting is. It involves actual work, it involves resilience, and in the face of exasperation, anxiety, unrelenting close attention to the newborn, extreme exhaustion, sacrifice of sleep, sacrifice of the pursuit of other interests. A father who chooses to share this experience for his own well-being, no less of that of his children and their mother, can indeed complain that the absence of equal recognition in the BCEA is unfair discrimination. A mother can, on the same premise, rightly complain that to assign her a role as the primary caregiver who should bear the rigors of parenthood single-handedly is a choice that she and the father should make, not the legislature. And in denying the parents the right to choose for themselves impairs her dignity. So, what have been the changes that have been ordered by our courts? It has been declared that the provisions of sections 25, sections 25 capital A, sections 25 capital B, and 25 capital C of the Basic Conditions of Employment Act 75 of 1997, and the corresponding provisions of the Unemployment Insurance Fund Act 63 of 2001, sections 24, sections 26 capital A, sections 27, 29 capital A are invalid by reason of inconsistency with sections 9 and 10 of our Constitution, to the extent that the provisions, number one, unfairly discriminate between mothers and fathers, unfairly discriminate between one set of parent and another on the basis of whether the children were born of the mother, conceived by surrogacy, or were adopted. The declaration of invalidity is suspended for 2 years from the date of this judgment to allow the Parliament to cure the defects. And number three, pending remedial reaction being enacted, the provisions shall read as follows. An employee who is a single parent is entitled, and employees who are a pair of parents are collectively entitled to at least 4 months consecutive parental leave, which in the case of a pair of parents may be taken in accordance with their election as follows. One or other parent shall take the whole of the period, or each parent shall take turns at taking the leave. Both employers must be notified prior to the date of birth in writing of the election, and if a shared agreement is chosen, the period or the periods to be taken by each of the parents must be stipulated. Wherever the word maternity is found is to be replaced with parental. The provisions of sections 25(7), 25 capital A5, 25 capital B5, and 25 capital C5, and the corresponding provisions of the Unemployment Act shall all be read to be consistent with the changes affected by this order, and accordingly each parent who is a contributor as defined by the Act shall be entitled to the benefits as prescribed therein. So, what of the business interests? There's an obvious direct financial implication on the unemployment fund. It can be stipulated that the number of people eligible for its benefits will multiply. Thus, it was contended that ultimately the additional benefits of leave will have a negative impact on the economy by diverting those resources of business. No evidence of such, though, was handed or placed before the court. As such, the court was not aided in any way for finding any basis for that argument. So let's talk on the best interest of the child, which deviates slightly from the standard Van Wyk illustration, in that it covers other categories of parenthood, namely adoption and surrogacy. True enough, it must be borne in mind that the Basic Conditions of Employment Act is a statute which addresses minimum benefits in relation to employment, and it is not necessarily an instrument to regulate family life or to prescribe the norms by which free people should organize their family life. The state does, however, nevertheless intervene in the realm, but does so in intervene in that realm, but does so in other statutes such as the Children's Act 35 of 2005, and that is of foremost importance in relation to this controversy in this case. Nonetheless, the Basic Conditions of Employment Act must find its application in a way that is in harmony with the Children's Act, no less than with the Constitution. Upon that premise, the leave entitlements and the duration of leave are provided for the purpose of the nurture of the baby or the toddler, not merely to allow a literal psychological recovery from giving birth. It seems plain that the distinctions made in the Basic Conditions of Employment Act are at odds with the objectives of Section 9 and 10 of our Constitution, and also at odds with the norms inherent in the Children's Act, because it differentiates between children born by a pregnant mother, by adoption, and through surrogacy. The first irrationality was the provision for a 10-week period of leave, commissioning for commissioning and adoptive mothers rather than 16. That which is given to the birth mother. During the 6 weeks after birth, during which a birth mother may not work except under certain prescribed conditions, and during which she is recovering physically, she is nevertheless nurturing her child in parallel. Why dock then the 7 weeks of leave available to the commissioning and adoptive mothers? Is it because they did not experience physical childbirth? What impelling rationale could inform the need for the distinction to be made? No honorable explanation comes to mind, and no legitimate governmental objective is discernible. The court held that the discrimination was unfair and that mothers in all three categories of the child in this judgment ought to be entitled to the same period of leave for the purpose of child nurture if inequality as prescribed by Section 9 of our Constitution is to be avoided. Now on to international standards. The literature shows that around the world, many countries have recognized that both parents should enjoy equal opportunities to engage in early child nurture. No country which has been provided such employment benefits has done so in any other way by that of statutes. It is notable that the provisions of the Basic Conditions of Employment Act were not per se in violation of any international instrument, whether or not South Africa has pledged allegiance thereto. In Clause 10 of the International Labour Organization Recommendation 191 of 2000, it is contemplated that leave must be available to fathers and adoptive mothers, despite the recommendation dealing otherwise, entirely with a birth mother's circumstances. Clause 10, subsection 5, calls specifically for leave for both adoptive parents. The Basic Conditions of Employment Act has complied in this way broadly but unequally. In the Convention of the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, 1981, to which South Africa acceded to in 1993, Article 5 provides, the state parties shall take appropriate measures to modify the social and cultural patterns of conduct of men and women with a view to achieving the elimination of prejudices and customary and all other practices which are based on the idea of inferiority or the superiority of other sexes or stereotyped roles for men and women. To ensure that family education includes a proper understanding of maternity as a social function and the recognition of the common responsibility of men and women in the upbringing and development of their children. It is being understood that the interest of children is the most important consideration in all cases. There are many examples in which other countries prescribe more generous periods of leave. So now, ladies and gentlemen, the 2025 father. Fathers who take leave help their partners, their families, and themselves. In this era of employee mental health challenges, companies must take notice. Post-COVID, we continue to see the grueling effects of the pandemic that it has had on employee populations. take women amongst those bearing the brunt of the economic and social fallout of this crisis. To help reduce the burnout among working mothers, what if more fathers took on the caregiving responsibilities in the home? What if they began making the commitment by taking paternity leave? What if taking time off improved not only the home, but the lives and work-life balances for the fathers, whilst also at the same time making them feel more positive about their own career and their employers? The cultural context around paternity leave is changing as more and more countries and companies are offering the benefit to new fathers. Men's use, however, of parental leave is increasing overall, even though the number of days being taken is still fairly minimal. Despite this, considerable shifts in cultural and employer support of fathers, less than half of men take advantage of all the leave benefits offered to them. While the challenge of getting men to take responsibility leave is long-standing, the COVID-19 crisis has created a fresh urgency for companies grappling with how to support employee well-being. Diverse employees have been hit especially hard, including working parents who continue to feel the stresses of work-life balance and also that of childcare. The benefits of paternity leave in the home begin most especially in the home. Support is critical to forging a stronger bond, and it is less about dividing the household task and more about providing emotional support and being present during early challenging days of baby care. Postpartum depression is also a reality, and having your partner there by your side mitigates the harsh effects of having to deal with the same alone. Hence, this strengthens the partnerships. Paternity leave helps spouses' careers, family finances, and it can also level the playing field for working mothers. Many fathers feel that allowing them to be at home will aid in reducing the stress on their partner. And not only does it allow new parents to preserve their careers, but also their identity, their relationship and worth as parents. In most instances, for fathers, spending time with their children gives them a sense of belonging and happiness, which inevitably leads, or rather aids, in feeling energized as an employee. Many appreciate the time to take off, as well as the support from their peers in making it happen. Baby showers for daddies have also become a trend in the workplace. In essence, there are far more pros than cons to paternity leave. Improving relationships and prioritizing family at the early stages of childbirth will lead in the long run to a stronger society, a community, and a country. One enriched with deep morals, values, togetherness, and integrity. Homes will remain joint and happy, and children will have the love and bond of both parents as positive role models. Let us support paternity leave. Let us be partners in the true sense of the word. I did promise to return, be it briefly, to the work of Sonke Gender Justice, whose role is time up.
Samkelisiwe, sorry, Sisi, you also have run out of your
Yes.
15 minutes. If you could go towards concluding.
Okay, I'm concluding now. I did promise, be it briefly, to speak on the work of Sonke Gender Justice, which role is public advocacy in support of gender equality and that of the Commission for Gender Equality, which is a Chapter 9 institution. Their involvement in cases for gender equality such as these is not only important for the development and the implementation of gender-inclusive HR institutional policies, but it is imperative. Ladies and gentlemen, we are over 30 years into our democracy, but gender parity still remains an elusive concept. So with that, I'd like to leave you with those thoughts. Thank you for giving me your time. I know I'm over the mark. And thank you also to the African Ombudsman Research Center for giving me your time. I hope you enjoy the rest of today.
Wow, thank you so much, Sanelisiwe, for this input. Wow, quite an interesting take on the gendered perspective, both in the workplace and outside of the workplace, and calling upon fathers to be given a chance to take responsibility for their children, not just financially, but being present in the development and the growth of the child itself. I think it's going to take, it requires a lot of advocacy. It requires also a lot of education for men, because I think socialization has really made women to naturally think that they are caregivers, and to allow fathers to come in and out of the children's lives as they wish in some communities, of course. So thank you for that. I don't see any specific questions to you on the chart, but there were questions that were sent. If you can spend about 3 minutes and just generally reflect on any of the questions, we understand that you have to exit as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Makasi. I had previously alluded to Frankie and to Marian that I have noted the questions that have been sent on email. I will be responding to same in writing and provide those responses in writing. And also I will provide the cases and also the discussion that has been shared today. Without taking much more of your time, thank you so much for allowing me to present, and also please do have a great day to everybody who's been joined in. I hope that the next speakers will just be as informative to you going forward.
Thank you so much for that, Samkelisiwe. I'm going to move to the next speaker now, who happens to be from Argentina. Honorable Veronica, I'm trying to read the surname here. Apologies for that. Yeah, Honorable Veronica Manquil, and she is a coordinator of Gender and Sexual Diversity Team at Argentina's National Prison Ombudsman Office, and lectures in undergraduate and postgraduate courses. She has a degree in sociology from the University of Buenos Aires and master's in criminology and legal penal sociology. She is going to speak to us on a topic that's looking at investigating gender-based complaints and promoting women's access to justice, best practice for developing gender-sensitive policies. Over to you, Honorable Veronica Manquil. Thank you.
Muchas gracias. Bueno, buenos días a todos y a todas. Y disculpen que voy a hablar en castellano, en español. Bueno, como mencionaban en la presentación, desde hace varios años que me desempeño en la coordinación del equipo de género y diversidad de la Procuración. Mientras que converso voy a compartir pantalla. Ahí está. Se ve bien, ¿no?
Yes.
Thank you. En este rol tuve la oportunidad de acercarme a una realidad que, bueno, es compleja, por supuesto, y que muchas veces está invisibilizada, y que es, bueno, justamente todo aquello que ocurre tras los muros de la cárcel, y, bueno, y que involucra también el impacto que tiene en la vida de quienes la transitan, no solo en las personas detenidas, sino también en sus familias. En la Procuración, nuestro trabajo consiste fundamentalmente en defender los derechos de las personas privadas de la libertad en Argentina. Buscamos en este sentido ser un canal de denuncia, un espacio de escucha y una vía de acceso a la justicia. Y en este sentido creemos que la presencia cercana, sostenida, continua, ¿no?, de las instituciones y de las organizaciones de la sociedad civil dentro de las cárceles, bueno, es clave para reducir la violencia dentro de estos espacios. Digamos, y esta presencia además también creemos que es importante que se haga a través del cristal que brinda, ¿no?, la perspectiva de género y de derechos humanos. En principio, bueno, me interesaba, a ver si puedo, compartirles, bueno, qué es la procuración penitenciaria. La procuración es una institución pública, autónoma, que forma parte del Poder Legislativo, es decir, que depende directamente del Congreso Nacional, fue creado en 1993, y como les decía, bueno, tiene esta misión clara, que es la defensa de los derechos humanos de las personas detenidas. En este sentido, contamos con la facultad y la posibilidad de visitar regularmente todos los espacios de encierro, todos los espacios carcelarios, entrevistarnos personalmente con las personas detenidas de manera confidencial y en este sentido también investigar denuncias de hechos de malos tratos y tortura y, bueno, también hacer informes y recomendaciones vinculados a problemáticas que hacen a la vida dentro de la prisión. En este marco, desde el equipo de género y diversidad en particular, nos dedicamos específicamente a visibilizar cómo la cárcel impacta de manera diferencial en determinados cuerpos y en determinadas identidades en función de la variable de género. Como seguramente muchos de ustedes sepan, la cárcel, como toda institución social y moderna, fue pensada y diseñada a partir de las necesidades y las características del modelo varón, blanco, heterosexual, y en este sentido, las necesidades propias de las mujeres y de otras identidades no hegemónicas, bueno, no suelen ser atendidas y esto se traduce indefectiblemente en prácticas de discriminación, de desigualdad y de violencia. Bueno, hace más de 15 años que desde el equipo trabajamos en esta línea, que es promover políticas penales y penitenciarias más inclusivas y que sean pensadas además desde un enfoque de género. Aprovecho también para comentarles que las fotografías que están en la presentación son de fotógrafas argentinas que son muy reconocidas y que en algunas oportunidades han registrado la vida en las cárceles de mujeres. Como desde el equipo, bueno, trabajamos a partir de una serie de objetivos que pueden resumirse en, como decíamos, promover políticas penitenciarias inclusivas que respondan a los principios de igualdad, de no discriminación y que sean pensadas desde un enfoque de género y una mirada interseccional también. Bueno, también investigar y denunciar casos de tortura y malos tratos perpetrados por las fuerzas de seguridad. Producir datos propios, en esto hay una línea muy importante de producción de estadísticas propias sobre las diferentes problemáticas vinculadas a la vida en prisión. También monitorear las condiciones de detención en espacios específicos, como pueden ser los pabellones que alojan a las mujeres embarazadas o con hijos menores de 4 años, o los pabellones específicos para población transgénero. Y también, bueno, trabajamos en la elaboración de informes, de recomendaciones y de presentaciones judiciales, y también tenemos una línea muy fuerte de elaboración de informes alternativos para que sean presentados a organismos internacionales, bueno, informes alternativos a los oficiales, digamos, del Estado. Por último, tenemos también la posibilidad de impulsar proyectos legislativos y eso es una función también que es muy valiosa a la hora de trabajar en políticas inclusivas. Nuestra labor se apoya en normas internacionales y estándares internacionales y nacionales, como son, bueno, ustedes bien saben, las reglas de Van Gogh, la Convención de Belén do Pará, la Convención del CEDAW, y también a nivel nacional, bueno, nos apoyamos, por supuesto, en la ley que regula en Argentina la pena privativa de la libertad, pero también, bueno, obviamente que tomamos la ley nacional de protección integral para la protección, para prevenir, sancionar y erradicar la violencia contra las mujeres, y también la ley de identidad de género, que en Argentina y en otras partes del mundo es una ley muy relevante, importante, ¿no? Y bueno, y sobre la que nosotros también trabajamos. Bueno, dado que yo, como dijeron en la presentación, yo soy socióloga, para mí, bueno, la investigación es una tarea muy importante también. Entonces, mi intención era, para plantearles algunas de las líneas de trabajo, acercarles a algunas de las investigaciones, a una de las principales investigaciones que realizamos desde el organismo. Un punto de partida clave para el surgimiento, la conformación del equipo de género fue esta investigación, Mujeres en prisión, los alcances del castigo, que fue publicada en el 2010, junto con otros organismos institucionales y también organizaciones sociales. Y este trabajo nos permitió describir quiénes eran las mujeres presas en Argentina, también cómo eran sus trayectorias de criminalización y cuáles eran sus experiencias de encierro. Los resultados en este sentido de este estudio fueron fundamentales. Dentro de la Procuración marcaron la necesidad de adoptar una política de género al interior del organismo. Y esto fue también reconocido por organismos internacionales que identificaron como un valor agregado para los mecanismos de prevención de la tortura, que tengan dentro de su organigrama una oficina de género. Y hacia afuera también nos posicionó como un espacio de referencia en el campo, digamos, de las políticas de género y el sistema penitenciario. En esta investigación surgieron varias líneas de trabajo, pero menciono una que me parece que es interesante para plantear la importancia entre la investigación y las políticas públicas. Un dato que surgió fue la alta proporción de mujeres presas que eran madres en hogares monoparentales, donde ellas eran las únicas responsables del cuidado de sus hijos. Por este motivo, su detención traía y trae consecuencias mucho más graves para sus hijos, que en muchos casos implica la rotación por distintos hogares, la interrupción de los estudios, la separación de los hermanos y en algunos casos más graves, bueno, hasta puede llegar a la institucionalización de los niños. Este dato nos permitió luego trabajar en un proyecto de modificación de la ley de arresto domiciliario en el cual se contemple el supuesto de las mujeres embarazadas y con hijos pequeños, específicamente menores de 5 años. Posteriormente, y ya con la modificación de la ley, bueno, también trabajamos fuertemente en promover en la justicia el acceso de las mujeres que cumplían, digamos, con estos supuestos a esta medida alternativa. Otro trabajo que realizamos en el 2019 y que se tituló Parí como una condenada, experiencias de violencia obstétrica de mujeres privadas de la libertad, también fue muy relevante. Algo que advertimos era que no había suficiente información acerca de las vivencias de las mujeres en este momento específico que es el preparto, parto y posparto. En la investigación trabajamos alrededor de un interrogante que era de qué hablábamos cuando hablamos de violencia obstétrica en cárceles. Y en esa intersección del fenómeno de la violencia obstétrica pensada en contexto de encierro, pudimos identificar una serie de dimensiones que nos permitían dar cuenta justamente de qué era esta problemática. Bueno, digamos, cuestiones vinculadas a los obstáculos al momento de garantizar un acompañamiento durante el parto y el posparto, que sabemos que es muy importante que la mujer que va a parir esté acompañada por alguien de su confianza, la ausencia de móviles específicos para el traslado de personas gestantes, la falta de acceso a información sobre sus procesos reproductivos y, por supuesto, y la más gravosa, la aplicación de medidas de sujeción durante el parto. ¿Qué nos permitió esta investigación? Mejorar el acceso a la justicia de muchas mujeres presas que sufrían violencia y discriminación durante el preparto, parto y posparto, y mejorar la escucha, esto nos parece como muy importante, mejorar la escucha por parte de los operadores de la justicia y también modificar las prácticas médicas y penitenciarias sobre estas mujeres. Luego de este trabajo y de su difusión, bueno, pudimos colaborar en la elaboración de diferentes guías y protocolos de atención específico para mujeres que transitaban su embarazo estando presas y para que sean adoptadas tanto en los servicios penitenciarios como en los servicios de salud. Por último, me gustaría también compartir esta investigación que hicimos ya recientemente, en el 2020, y que se tituló Mujeres trans privadas de la libertad, la invisibilidad tras los muros. Acá también todas estas investigaciones las hicimos con organizaciones y organismos públicos, que me parece que también le da un valor agregado. En esta investigación pudimos dar cuenta de la sobrerepresentación de las mujeres trans en América Latina, principalmente detenidas por delitos de las políticas punitivas de drogas, ¿no? Y en prisión lo que se destacaba era, bueno, que enfrentaban múltiples hechos de violencia y discriminación vinculados a su identidad. Y en este sentido, la falta de datos públicos, bueno, profundiza su invisibilización. En el informe, nosotras sostenemos que se necesitan reformas legales y políticas públicas integrales con perspectiva de género que permitan justamente garantizar los derechos humanos de las mujeres trans. Por último, me interesaba también hacer referencia a una línea que es fundamental dentro del organismo, que es justamente en relación a la prevención de la tortura. En este campo, desde el equipo, nos propusimos hace tiempo discutir alrededor de la categoría de tortura y analizar cuáles eran las prácticas específicas que se aplicaban sobre las mujeres y las personas del colectivo LGBT. En este camino, bueno, lo que observamos es que había muchos casos de administración forzada de medicación psiquiátrica por vía inyectable a mujeres que eran arbitrariamente, digamos, catalogadas por el servicio penitenciario como demandantes, y lo digo entre comillas, demandantes y conflictivas. Lo que notamos es que la forma de gestión del conflicto interno por parte de la fuerza de seguridad, en el caso de las mujeres específicamente, no solo implicaba el aislamiento y la violencia física, sino que también estaba acompañada del suministro involuntario de psicofármacos. Desde el equipo se denunció en reiteradas oportunidades, se denunció penalmente estas prácticas, y también lo incorporamos dentro de nuestros registros y protocolos internos de los registros de casos de tortura y malos tratos. Y en este sentido, bueno, digamos, como les decía anteriormente, contamos con estadísticas propias que dan cuenta del fenómeno de la violencia de género, de la violencia contra las mujeres y las personas LGBT en clave de violencia institucional. Y eso es, bueno, digamos, es un desafío también, ¿no? De pensar en otro tipo de violencias, no solo la doméstica, no solo la sexual, sino también la institucional. Bueno, para cerrar y ya agradeciendo, pero me gustaría resaltar dos cuestiones. Sabemos que los derechos dentro de las cárceles deben ser garantizados y que es necesario trabajar firmemente en este sentido, pero también sabemos que la cárcel es un espacio complejo, violento y que produce dolor. Y desde esa realidad no creemos que más cárcel signifique más seguridad. Por el contrario, creemos que debemos avanzar hacia políticas penales que promuevan medidas alternativas a la prisión y que se apoyen en la comunidad. En esta línea también nos parece fundamental fortalecer redes y acompañar a las organizaciones sociales, fundamentalmente, que trabajan con la población privada de la libertad. En nuestro país existe una experiencia muy valiosa y muy singular, que es la organización de las personas detenidas y exdetenidas que frente a la falta de políticas pospenitenciarias y a la discriminación que pesa sobre ellas, se decidieron conformar cooperativas de trabajo, organizarse y conformar cooperativas de trabajo, y en esto hay experiencias muy interesantes de mujeres exdetenidas que formaron estas experiencias de cooperativismo. Esa es, creemos, una muestra concreta de que otra forma de pensar la igualdad, la seguridad y la inclusión es posible. Muchas gracias.
Thank you. Sorry, just having a connection issue here. But thank you very much. I think that the interpretation, I listened to it because I couldn't understand. And I picked up a few issues that I think many of the countries can learn, especially the country where I come from, which is South Africa. And one of the issues that are being raised, that Honorable Veronica is raising, is that they do research and are supposed to influence policy and decision making, focusing on the centers, on the prisons. And they also investigate cases of gender-based violence in the facilities, and especially cases affecting women and transgender communities. They are in alignment with the international standards, as well as the local legislation and other provisions within the country. And I think also importantly, and that I find quite attractive about this presentation, is these reports that are being produced, research reports that are being produced, specifically focusing on profiling these women who are in these facilities. I think if every country does that, they would get real stories around these women and why they're in these facilities, women who are involved in drugs and why they end up in the drug trade. Drug trade globally is a trade that is allegedly run by men, and they use women in order to push the business and transport drugs in between different countries. Even in South Africa, we've seen many cases interestingly, actually, there's a young woman I studied with in high school who ended up in the drug business and was arrested in one of the countries for many years. And so there's just so many experiences of how women get into the drug trade because of the lifestyle it promises and etc. And it's usually very vulnerable younger women who think that things may come easy and there's quick money that they can need, that they can be able to get access to. Thank you so much, Honorable Veronica, for that. I will come back to you for the question time because you are still part of the panel. I will move swiftly to Dr. Janine Hicks, who will be speaking to us about partnerships, advocacy, and promoting systemic gender equality. She is a senior lecturer at the School of Law, and she also has a PhD and an LLB from the University of KwaZulu-Natal. And it's not written where she's a senior lecturer at. I would assume it's the School of Law in the University of KwaZulu-Natal, but you will clarify, Dr. Janine Hicks, in the profile. I didn't pick that up. She also has a master's in arts in development studies. Over to you, Dr. Janine Hicks. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Yoliswa, and good morning, colleagues. I greet and acknowledge our public protector, Advocate Kalega, and the other honorable ombuds present with us this morning, and to my fellow colleagues on the panel, Honorable Mankel, and Samujali. Indeed, I am a lecturer. Here's my law school behind me. My office is here, that window. I'm at the School of Law at UKZN. I have been asked to speak particularly on, I'm just bringing up my screen for you, the role of public protectors and ombudsmen in advancing systemic gender equality. And let me just put that on large screen. And if you don't mind, I'm going to turn off my video while I'm presenting, because the quality of the connection is never good when I have everything going. So the three things that I'm going to be addressing in my inputs. My primary focus is on answering the question and posing for you the question, what is the role of your office? What is the role of the Ombudsman in driving a gender equity agenda in the public sector? And I'm delighted at the inputs that have been made by our speakers thus far, because I think they've highlighted really pragmatic and practical examples of the manner in which the Office of the Ombudsman, through research, monitoring, specific investigation on systemic issues and reporting, can be bringing a spotlight to systemic examples of gender discrimination, gender inequality, and violation of gender equality rights. So I really appreciate the wonderful, vivid, practical examples that have been painted, and I'll pull them up because they really are helpful. So when we contemplate then what is the role, and is there acceptance in the room that in fact this is your role? If you are taking on this role, what kinds of different interventions are required? What kinds of policy advocacy interventions are required of an ombudsman? And then related to that, what strategic partnerships can and should you be engaging in order to undertake that work and deliver on promoting a gender equity agenda in the public sector? As a starting point, let us examine the role of the Ombudsman in the public sector. And thanks, Advocate Kgalega at the outset of a welcoming address reminded us what is the mandate typically of an ombudsman. It is to investigate, report, and remedy improper conduct in state affairs, but equally to investigate and report on systemic failures. So if we take then that mandate, addressing improper conduct in state affairs and investigating and reporting on systemic issues, and you might now ask, well, how does this connect with issues of gender equality and promoting gender equity? And I want to suggest that perhaps you're more familiar with this aspect, this driving gender equity internally within state departments. So if we focus on that first aspect, the mandate to investigate, report, and remedy improper conduct of state affairs, I would argue that it falls within your remit, within your mandate, to investigate, report, and issue remedial findings in relation to the state's improper conduct when it fails to address gender discrimination in the public sector. So in this first instance, your gaze is internally within government departments and public entities that fall under your scope of monitoring and investigation. Is there improper conduct? Are there administrative deficiencies? Are there failures in government departments, whether it is a Department of Correctional Services, for instance, Honorable Mankel, in the manner in which it is addressing gender equality within the prison, okay? Or it could be government departments in terms of gender transformation in the public sector. What have government departments failed to enact measures to promote women's representation within leadership within the government department, whether that's a Department of Land Reform or a Department of Education or a Department of Public Works. How are those government departments responding to the slow pace of transformation of women's representation in leadership that Advocate Kalega alluded to? Are government departments failing in responding to complaints of gender discrimination and sexual harassment and gender-based violence within those government departments? And again, Advocate Kalega spoke to that. So in that regard, if you are addressing gender equity as a systemic issue within state departments, you are looking at issues such as you would be interrogating then state policies. Have they put the appropriate human resource policies in place within that government department to effectively drive a gender transformation agenda? Have they got sexual harassment and gender-based violence policies in place? My colleague Samu Jali asked the question, have they got appropriate maternal and parental leave policies in place that enable men in government departments to take on parenting roles and tending to the needs of children, whether adopted or born into their families? Have government departments assigned adequate resources? Have they put in place adequate capacity and reporting and accountability measures? Dealing with individual complaints that you may be receiving from public sector employees about state discrimination within government departments and state failures to deal with sexual harassment and gender-based violence in the workplace within government departments. So that would be the scope of your investigation and your interrogation, to deal with that systemic set of issues of failure to transform internally within the public sector. Where would be your advocacy partners? Where would be your collaboration? I would suggest, for instance, here in South Africa, the Public Protector South Africa would be collaborating with the sister institution, the Commission for Gender Equality, as well as our Public Service Commission. We also have in South Africa an Employment Equity Commission that deals with employment equity reporting. In other countries, I'm sure you have public sector organized trade unions or organized structures with whom you would be collaborating and advocating, gathering the kinds of statistics and evidence that you need that bear out these state failures, gathering and collecting individual complaints that require response, and then engaging with executive leadership, whether it's a premier's office within a province or a presidency or cabinet in relation to departments' failures to implement their obligations to ensure gender equality within their government departments. So there I offer you, first of all, as a neat little package, how might you drive gender equity internally, examining women's leadership representation, examining practices and policies within government departments, addressing systemic failures and complaints raised by public sector employees within government departments. So that would be the internal mandate. Let's move, though, now to an external consideration. And I flag and raise for you then a question. What would be the role of the Ombudsman to drive an agenda to promote systemic gender equity externally? So not within government departments, but in the work that government departments do. What would the role of the Ombudsman be in advocating for state gender mainstreaming of service delivery? Right? And again, we have lovely examples that were raised. Honorable Mankel spoke about our prison department, for instance, or our correctional services facilities. Are they addressing the treatment of transgender inmates within prisons? What kind of policy response is there to gender equality issues within the prison? Advocate Kalega gave a great example of when you keep getting reports of failures by our maintenance system, challenges experienced by women in accessing maintenance orders from our maintenance courts. Okay, so when you pick up that there are systemic gender equality failures in the manner in which government departments are delivering services, what is the role of the Ombudsman and where would you be investigating? Again, now, I would argue that you're investigating, first of all, what are the state institutions' failures in terms of implementing its obligations in terms of international law. And my colleague Samu painted a very vivid picture for you of international law obligations on states to enact measures to eradicate gender inequality. So thank you, Samu, for that detailed input. So your starting point would be to investigate, well, have those individual government departments enacted appropriate measures to implement their obligations in terms of those international conventions, and at a country level, whatever constitutional commitments they have signed up to towards promoting equality, as well as then the domestic legislative framework. So in a South African context, for comparative purposes, you would be asking the question, have government departments enacted internally appropriate measures to address employment equity? But then externally, have government departments enacted appropriate measures in response to our Promotion of Equality and Prevention of Unfair Discrimination Act, PEPUDA? Have, for instance, our justice sector, our Department of Justice, our police services, have they enacted adequate measures to ensure the implementation of our Protection from Harassment Act, our Domestic Violence Act, our Sexual Offences Act? So those would be issues in relation to gender-based violence. Have our justice systems, this would be your investigation, I submit, have our government justice institutions enacted adequate measures to ensure that they're delivering on, and my example here is their responsibilities to deal with gender-based violence. But equally, you could follow the same line of thinking and say, have our government departments enacted appropriate measures to ensure delivery on their obligations in relation to maintenance? Okay. Secondly, though, however, I feel that the Ombudsman offices could investigate state institutions' failures to gender mainstream service delivery, with those resulting systemic patterns that we see coming through, for instance, in our maintenance courts, or violations of the rights to equality within our prisons. But equally, you could take your gaze to the housing sector, the land sector, social security sector, healthcare. Have our government departments adequately picked up their obligations in terms of the Beijing Platform of Action to do those gender audits and to mainstream and surface those particular vulnerabilities and discriminations experienced? Yoliswa spoke about the intersectionalities. I think the how those compact, or it was Advocate Kalega speaking about how intersectionalities of race, gender, disability, sexual orientation can compound the discrimination and the inequality experienced. So have our departments of housing, have our departments of land reform and rural development enacted measures that surface women's particular challenges in accessing housing? Are there state service delivery failures in ensuring that women have access to land and our land reform programs? Samu gave a beautiful example of social security challenges, access to maternity and parental leave. Have our Department of Social Development, have our Department of Employment and Labor, have they enacted adequate legislation that ensures that all workers have got access to maternity and parental benefits to ensure that that we are providing support for mothers and fathers in raising children and in working? And what are the gender dimensions and the challenges in accessing equally healthcare services? Again, have our state institutions failed to enact programs, policies, and budgets that ensure men, women, gender non-conforming people have got equal access to those services? I would argue that this falls within your mandate. And again, this would require a new set of strategies for the Ombudsman in undertaking this research, in accessing the relevant data and statistics that you need, and partnerships, both with entities within state institutions, but then also with civil society organizations, to be eliciting those kinds of challenges and complaints to investigate systemic issues. Further, in relation to service delivery, and these really, I'm just expanding more on the points that I've made, part of your investigation would be an analysis of legislation enacted by those government departments. So I raised in the previous slide, have state departments enacted adequate measures? What would you analyze there? What would form part of your investigation? You would undertake an analysis of legislation to identify where are those gaps that are invisibilizing women's exclusion, that are invisibilizing women's marginalization, and that are perpetuating gender inequality. And I give here for you some examples just so that you can see what that might look like. For instance, in South Africa, our occupational injury, we have the compensation for occupational injury and diseases in the workplace legislation. That used to exclude domestic workers from accessing compensation. Right there, you have an exclusion of a marginalized group of predominantly Black, poor, working women, preventing them from enjoying equal access to rights and protections in the workplace. Likewise, in South Africa, our legislation pertaining to unemployment insurance excludes informal economy workers. So all our women street traders and their partners and self-employed women may not contribute to our unemployment insurance fund, which means there's no unemployment insurance, there's no maternity leave, there's no 4 months paid leave or 10 days parental leave for any of those workers because legislation excludes them. You might want to examine in your countries your own civil rights legislation pertaining to marriage and childcare and inheritance, and ask, does that marginalize and exclude same-sex couples? Does it marginalize and exclude gender diverse people from having access to the protections accorded to heterosexual couples in relation to marriage and childcare? So that would form scope for your analysis and your research. You would be looking at policy implementation. So even if government departments have got appropriate legislation and policy, are they failing in their implementation? Are they failing to address persistent examples of discrimination, of violations, and of marginalization? So you might, for instance, look at climate change and mitigation strategies and resources needed, and ask whether small-scale farmers, women farmers, are involved in discussion in relation to climate change response, in access to the kinds of resources that they need for water scarcity, for instance. You might look at a country's land reform process and land reform mechanisms and statistics on land claims processes to ask why, and the example here in South Africa for our land reform process, 90% of land claims and land reform beneficiaries are men. Women only constitute 10% of our land reform and land claims processes in South Africa. That should warrant a systemic investigation into policy implementation failures. How have our relevant government departments, our land courts, or our Department of Rural Development and our Department of Land has invisibilized or marginalized women's challenges in accessing land reform? You might look at small business and economic development support measures implemented by your Department of Employment and Labor or your small SMME structures within the state. Are they addressing the needs of women-owned businesses? And I spoke earlier about state response to gender-based violence. And again, in relation to advocacy, who would you be needing to engage with? Which policymakers? What partnerships with community advocacy groups and social movements? I'm going to take a slight shift and bring your attention. Yes?
I just want to bring to your attention that your 15 minutes is expired.
Okay, so I won't speak to this. I will then point to this resource for you. I just said then in your engagement with community advocacy groups to surface these kinds of gender equality challenges. I would invite you to contemplate the skills that you might require as the ombuds in engaging with communities. And I leave these slides with you to consider. In your handling of complaints and in your handling of community investigation, how would you deal with gender discrimination in the room? How would you deal with pushback from community stakeholders, for instance, in relation to women's land ownership? How do you conduct a gender-sensitive assessment of a complaint? How do you ensure that in your own investigation as the Ombudsman in your team, are you promoting gender diversity? And finally, when you are undertaking these issues and engaging with stakeholders on gender discrimination, being mindful of the fact that you may be putting women and gender diverse stakeholders at risk when you're challenging gender discrimination. So in conclusion, colleagues, I would argue that as Ombudsman, you can adopt strategies to enhance women's voice and agency in dealing with these complaints. I would argue that it is imperative that you adopt measures to ensure that your complaints mechanisms and your own investigative procedures are gender responsive, and that you build the capacity of your teams to adopt this work. I share with you the previous slide, this web link here. This is drawn from the Compliance Advisor Ombudsman from the World Bank Group. I worked with a team to develop guidelines on how to adopt a gender inclusive approach to dispute resolution, a very practical set of guidelines and a toolkit on how to do this work from a gender inclusive perspective. And I offer this with the hope that this will be a useful resource. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Janine Hicks, for the presentation. A lot of practical ideas on how to go about doing the advocacy work and the collaborations and etc. And I will now invite both the panelists that are still connected to, in 3 to 5 minutes, please, my bosses in UKZN are letting me that we are running out of time. 3 to 5 minutes, if you could please reflect on the questions that were sent and asked ahead of this session. And also, if perhaps you could send some of the responses in writing so that we can be able to share them to everybody, because you not have time to answer each of the questions. I saw quite a number of questions, detailed questions. I'm going to start with Honorable McQuill to please take your 3 to 5 minutes. And when I show my video, just know your time is up. Thank you.
Sí, si le parece, puedo enviar por escrito las consultas. Yo estuve viendo ahí algunas preguntas también que enviaron mientras conversaba, pero bueno, estoy a disposición para responder las consultas que tengan igualmente, y se las puedo enviar por correo.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I think that that's acceptable. The colleagues at the Research Center will do a follow-up in respect to that. Dr. Hicks?
Thanks, Yuliso. I'd identified 4 questions that I thought I could comment on. The one question was, how can ombuds offices measure structural gender gaps within their institutions? Related to that, there's a question, what policies guide gender inclusivity? What tools are most effective in addressing gender inequality within an institution? And I wanted to share with you, what are the appropriate policies? What should you target? What are the interventions you should undertake? The starting point would be to undertake a review of your policy framework. And our own Employment Equity Commission in South Africa has identified 3 key policies within the HR slate that drive gender transformation in the workplace. The first is your policy in relation to promotion. Your second is your policy in relation to recruitment. And your third is your policy in relation to capacity building and training. So interrogate those 3 policies to ensure that they are opening opportunities for women to be identified and brought in and recruited and promoted into leadership, and to be granted access to adequate capacity building and training to take on leadership roles. Equally, however, our colleagues have pointed to HR policies such as maternity and parental leave and sexual harassment. Those are persistent barriers to gender equality within the workplace. And finally, I would say have a look at your own employment equity targets and statistics, whether or not you're reaching those. There was a second question on how can the Ombuds Office use gender data and statistics to improve the design and delivery of services. And this, I think, speaks to the comments that are made about driving an external approach to promoting gender equity and gender mainstreaming. So the question would be, how do we use gender data? How do we use statistics to monitor gender mainstreaming by government departments? And I would argue that as part of your systemic investigation, you would be analyzing departmental budgets and departmental annual reporting to track those systemic failures in addressing gender inequality. There was a third interesting question around what strategies can be adopted to ensure the sustainability of gender inclusive policies despite administrative changes. So when there have been commitments to gender equality, and yet we know leadership changes, we have change in administration, and we might lose those gains. A strategy to adopt would be to embed obligations and responsibilities for the promotion of gender equality within the job descriptions and within the performance management of leadership. Make it a leadership responsibility. Ensure that budgets are developed and assigned so that that work of driving gender equality and gender inclusivity is institutionalized within the institution's budget and responsibility framework and in management reporting, both at an individual level, the performance management of executive leadership, but also in the structural reporting, for instance, in management meetings and in board meetings. And then a final question, and this might be to help you if you're encountering pushback within your office. So you're wanting to champion gender equality and you're getting pushback from your colleagues and saying, but this is biased. Why are you singling out the protection of women's rights? As the Ombuds Office, we must ensure the protection of all people's rights. If you're undertaking measures that are promoting women's rights or addressing women's vulnerability, that is bias and that is discrimination. Arm yourself with the information that you need to counter that kind of pushback you might experience within your own office when you're wanting to champion this. Draw on the equality conventions and treaties that your country has ratified, such as CEDAW and Beijing, because those treaties and conventions demand of state institutions that they adopt necessary measures to eliminate all forms of discrimination. They demand, for instance, Beijing Platform for Action demands the undertaking of gender audits and gender mainstreaming. Our constitutions further demand measures, I'm finishing, to address systemic inequality. So I think you could push back by saying that discrimination by the state is unconstitutional, it's unlawful, and it is a violation of state obligations in terms of international law, and therefore it falls within the mandate of the Ombudsman to take up discrimination and failures by the state. That's my suggestion, that you can be gender activists in your space.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hicks. on that practical ideas again on how to go around some of the stuff in ensuring an inclusive, a gender inclusive system in our various countries. We've come to an end, but I do want to just say that I think a lot of issues have come out of this session, and I do want to say that I have worked in the South African Public Service for all my working life until end of February 2025. And I think that and I've interacted with lots of countries, especially the countries within the African region in terms of my work. And I think that you as ombuds across the globe, you've got so much work just looking at what Dr. Janine has shared as some of the things that you could be doing within your mandates. There's a lot of work that you could do. It will keep you busy 365 days a year if you are not busy. But I don't think there can be any ombuds who's not as busy in the current global challenges that we're faced with. But I do want to say that for the public protector in South Africa, I have a lot of inside information for you on some of these issues that are being raised here. And I think that it's really important that this office really gives attention to these particular matters. For instance, just on the policy of 50% in the public sector of women in decision-making at 50% level, meaning in senior management roles, South Africa has been just going down over a period of time. I think it was early mid-2000s when we were able to reach the 50% and go slightly above. Since then, we have just been going down and going down. And it is difficult, really, if there's no champions for women in institutions to ensure these promotions take place and a gendered approach is implemented. It is difficult in the system itself because the system is very gender neutral to be able to pull up women and ensure that they get these opportunities that they are entitled to. So there's a lot that needs to be done. But I do want to close here, and I do want from my part to say thank you very much for this opportunity. I have learned a lot of stuff out of this conversation, and I look forward to how I use this stuff as well in my new role at the New South Institute, as well as the reform work that I'm working on and the papers and policy briefs that we do in relation to this work. And I do think that we would like to work with you as well, Public Protector South Africa, on some of these areas around reforms. But I am going to hand over now to Marion, who is going to give the closing remarks. From my part, I really just want to say thank you to all of you, Excellencies, and the Honorable Ombudsman from the different parts of the globe. It's been a very useful and educational session for myself too. I suppose it's the same for you. There's lots of insight and practical ideas. Thank you.
Thank you, Honorable Facilitator. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone joining from across the globe. On behalf of the African Ombudsman Research Center and the African Ombudsman and Mediators Association, I want to express our sincere gratitude to everyone who made or who participated in today's webinar. To our panelists, Ms. Samukelisiwe Jali, thank you for your practical insights on creating equitable workplaces, particularly your reflections on how inclusive HR policies can support parents and transform organizational culture. Honorable Veronica Manquel, we are grateful for your powerful examples from Argentina, showing how investigating gender-based complaints and promoting women's access to justice can drive systemic change. Dr. Janine Hicks, your guidance on partnerships and advocacy reminded us that lasting gender equity requires collaboration, strategy, and courage. To our panelists, thank you for your practical and insightful reflections on building equitable workplaces and for showing how truly inclusive HR policies can support parents and transform organizational cultures. A heartfelt thank you to our facilitator, Ms. Yolisa Makasi, for guiding the session so smoothly and creating a space where these important conversations could happen with openness and depth. To our audience, as of this morning, we had 377 registrations from 58 countries across 6 continents. Thank you for showing us that this is a truly global dialogue. Your questions and participation enrich today's discussions and show the importance of sharing knowledge across borders. Thank you also to UKZN for their continued support of the African Ombudsman Research Centre. At this point, I would like to pause and share a letter we received from the Public Independent Conciliator from the Republic of Cameroon. It says, to the African Ombudsman Research Centre, I acknowledge with gratitude the invitation to the upcoming webinar on gender inclusive policies, organized in commemoration of South Africa Women's Month. I salute the African Ombudsman Research Centre, the African Ombudsman and Mediators Association, and the International Ombudsman Institute for convening such an important dialogue at a time when fairness cannot be fully achieved without the embrace of inclusion. As the Public Independent Conciliator of the South-West region of Cameroon, I have come to appreciate deeply that fairness in public governance cannot be achieved if gender remains an afterthought. Our experience has shown that gender-sensitive approaches are indispensable to the credibility of ombudsman institutions. From rural women asserting rights to livelihood and property, through young girls confronting systemic barriers in education, to professionals navigating inequities in the workplace, the need for policies that restore balance in the architecture of justice is both evident and urgent. In this light, your efforts to highlight practical strategies for embedding gender into ombudsman work remain highly commendable. I therefore warmly salute this initiative, both as a celebration of South Africa Women's Month and as part of the wider machinery advancing equity across our continent. The exchange of ideas during this dialogue will undoubtedly enrich ombudsman institutions as true beacons of fairness and inclusion. Please accept the assurances of my highest consideration. That's from the Public Independent Conciliator from the Southwest Region, Republic of Cameroon. To continue with my vote of thanks, today's discussions reminded us that gender inclusion isn't just policy on paper. It's a value that must guide how we lead, how we investigate, and how we serve our communities. Thank you once again for joining us, and we look forward to welcoming you to our upcoming webinars as we continue this important journey together. Thank you very much, everybody. Bye.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you so much. Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Bye.
Muchas gracias.
Thank
Adiós.
you. Bye.